Okay, Mr. Matt Manning, thank you for coming on the pod today. How you doing?
Good, yeah. Thanks for having me, Cole. Really looking forward to the conversation.
It's always funny to do like the double intro after just saying hello and talking again. You do it again. We're live.
Yeah, yeah,
Introduction.
totally.
Uh, you connected, you reached out to me over DM on Twitter and said Mr. Dave Heim had recommended us getting together and chatting about some synchronicities and similarities in how we see and think about the world. So first question, because I think the foundation of our parallels stem from Bitcoin and that we're Bitcoiners and see the world, through that lens, at least partially. My first question is I was going through some of your stuff and some of your deeper Bitcoin content that isn't your traditional how Bitcoin affects the bond markets. It's much deeper than
Yeah,
that, which I appreciate because I think Bitcoin is infinitely deeper than, financial markets and everything in that capacity. You talked about I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, a theophany, a Phany, theophany, perhaps. So I was wondering, what is that, and how does Bitcoin relate to it?
yeah. I'm trying to remember the
I think it
exact
was
thing
in
you're
your,
mentioning. Let
it
me try
was in
to.
the Mystical Essence of Bitcoin newsletter,
Yep.
and a
Yeah. Let me
theophany
just
was
try to reorient myself here.
sure.
Yeah. So I think where I was going with that, theophany can mean like a manifestation of deity
Okay.
in in a more subtle form. And in my opinion, Bitcoin cracked me open. It was kind of the first paradigm shift that was such a big shift that like made me start to question some of the more basic assumptions that led to more paradigm shifts in consciousness.
Hmm.
And, the more I've studied it and kind of overlaid Bitcoin with some of the more mystical teachings, that idea comes from uh, one of the teachers that I like to follow. Her name is Cynthia Bourgeault. She's a Christian mystic and Episcopal priest, and she writes in her book, The Eye of the Heart. It's a
Mm.
kind of non-standard book, but it talks about how there's this seeming entropy to life and the seeming randomness and chaos. And the more she taps into it, she thinks that, and this lines up with my own experience, that there's these other realms that are interpenetrating with our entropic kind of random realms, and that
Hmm.
they're counter entropic, and that like things that manifest in the world in form can originate from these other more subtle realms that aren't visible and perceptible to our human capacities. And so that kind of opened me up to this whole idea. And I'm not, this is just like me making up a theory,
Hmm.
um pure speculation, but what if like Satoshi himself like originated from another realm and was some other counter-entropic force that's trying to work with our earthly realm to help humanity and consciousness progress. So yeah, I'm with you that like there's a lot more going on in Bitcoin. Sure, it does affect the financial markets, and that's all really important, but that's like scratching the surface to some of the more subtle
Yeah,
nuance. Yeah.
that's super fascinating. I think the parallel is, well, I think it'll end up being, if it already isn't, one of the greatest mysteries in human existence, the essence and being of Satoshi Nakamoto, but I've never heard it related to a counter-entropic realm or Satoshi spawning essentially from that realm to essentially balance out our entropic realm. That's super interesting.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it goes back to this idea that like everything has its opposite and
right,
there's opposing forces everywhere.
duality, yeah.
And right. And so like, and then you transcend it and there's non-duality there. They're both the
Hmm.
same thing. So as I've gone deeper into that within consciousness, I'm like, we've got all this entropy and seeming randomness, there has to be
Where's the
some
other
other
side?
force on the other side. And I don't,
Yeah.
as human beings, we're not tapped into that. And to the intellect, that seems like wild and out there, and can just be like, that's a bunch of hooey. Um, but the deeper you go and the more you experience some of those subtle energies, uh, that seems to be possible to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the more possible it gets. What would you say, just out of curiosity, if you had to put your finger on Satoshi as a conceptualized form, who he is it a he? Is it, what would you, how would you describe it? How would you conceptualize Satoshi Nakamoto? Is he just a human being who's the most humble person ever, full of humility and intelligence, etc.? Is it deeper than that? I mean, it's you could theorize about it forever, theoretically.
Yeah, really interesting question. I think the short answer is I don't know, right? Like we
Yeah,
just said, like this
yeah.
is all just speculation, and
Which is so
really
cool.
anything, right? And you start to realize that like anything that humans make up is just a construction. All of it,
Yeah,
like everything that we're doing is just this story. And Cynthia Bourgeault talks about how um not all. Let me actually pull it up just so I can get the quote right. I think I have
let's
her
do it.
book
I love
right.
that.
I think I have her book right here. No, this is maybe not the one. She says something to the effect of not all constructions, all illusions are constructions, but or all constructions are illusions, but not all illusions are constructions, or maybe vice versa.
I
All
think
that
it's
to say that
vice
like
versa. Yeah.
everything is constructed. It's just a construction. It's just a story. Some stories are useful.
Yeah. Right.
Um, so I'll just preface that, like, that's kind of where we're going here.
Yeah.
Everything's constructed. As I started out in Bitcoin, and I remember the
Mm.
first time I read, uh, I'd been down the rabbit hole for a number of years, and I read Tomer Strolight's article, The Legendary Treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto, and it had more of this mystical flair to like the mystery of Satoshi. And I remember the first time I read that, like I'm a pretty intuitive person, and I can use my brain to connect logic, but like primarily the way I learn and follow, it's like really instinctual and like what I feel. And I felt something as I read that article
Mm.
that was like, oh, he's pointing to something here that's deeper than just what you see on the surface. So yeah, originally I've spent a lot of time, reading the different theories on like who is Satoshi? Is it a person? Is it a group? I think after a couple years of studying that, I kind of came to the conclusion it was more likely a group of people, and that if it was just a single person, they're probably not around anymore. I still think those are two basic possibilities, but what I'm opening up more and more to is like, okay, whoever these people are or were, or this group or individual, um, was this other, if there was another subtle realm involved, some outer force that we seemingly can't, that humans don't typically have access to or can't see because we
Hmm.
can't see it and touch it and feel it. Like, was that type of a realm just working through some human beings who were on this problem and had been working on these cryptographic problems? Or was there, or could it be that there was another intelligence, that like we're starting to see more and more that like there's other intelligent life that seems to be watching us, and you see it in the news, and I tend to think that there's reality to that. And if they're watching out for humanity and trying to counterbalance some of that, could they have just some force arrived and helped introduce that into the world here and then let it go? Also a possibility. I don't
Yeah.
know.
That is the ultimate answer, I think. I don't know, and that's really the ultimate answer to so many things. But uh
And I think it's like a feature of Bitcoin.
100%.
It's so
Yeah.
much a feature. The fact that like we don't know who created it. There isn't a marketing team. There's not a CEO, and this thing just organically has grown as it has in this network effect. Um, that speaks volumes to. the idea or the discovery that is Bitcoin. It's this emergent
Yes.
phenomenon, and I think we're barely scratching the surface on what it is, what its implications are, and yeah, compare that to other, and sometimes I say that to people like that's a feature, and they're like, "What do you mean?" Like, well, what if we find out who it is? Doesn't that change everything? And I'm like, what if it doesn't?
What if you don't find out who it is? What if it's a mystery forever? And I think
Yeah,
if
and yeah, either way, like I don't know that it changes much.
I don't think it does, but even I think it would if it was like Elon Musk who created it, for example, and we had a specified target. It's weird because on some sense you point it back to him, but on the other side, it's like Bitcoin has nothing to do with even Satoshi because like the person and the individual, because as soon as it was birthed out into the world, essentially, it took on a form of its own. And
Yeah.
it was separate in some sense from Satoshi, in the sense that he could have doxed himself, but it was already out there. And maybe there's stuff that
Hmm.
comes with it. But I do think it being a mystery sets the foundational essence for Bitcoin in this kind of
Hmm.
divine, mystical way that's so, even in my 3.5 years of study now, is basically impossible to actually put your finger on and grasp, which is really just life as a whole. It's not to be grasped, actually. Uh,
Hmm.
but I was I was curious because there's so many dots popping up that I'm wanting to connect. But something that popped up was, who were you like as a kid? Like what was your life like as a young Matt Manning? What were you curious about? What were you naturally drawn toward? What were you good at? What was school like for you? I'm curious what life was like for you back then.
Yeah, so I grew up and still live in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Cool.
So, very unique kind of the geography is beautiful culturally. It's Mormonism is
Yeah.
front and center. So I was born and raised still in part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or Mormons.
Hmm.
Um, that viewpoint and why I'm around and kind of the way I make sense of it has shifted significantly over the last few years. But yeah, as far as like what I was like as a kid, I was always pretty intuitive. Now that I'm starting to learn that like I would pick up on other people's emotions a lot. I didn't quite realize how much I did that, and it became hard for me over the years to like determine what was someone else's emotions versus mine. Like that kind of
Mm.
got really blurry, which actually led to a lot of dysfunction emotionally. I'm learning in my own journey, kind of healing journey, that there was a lot of dysfunction emotionally, kind of an internal war that was going on with some polarity inside of me. But I was always into sports. That's I was athletic, and my family's really into sports. So I just kind of pushed that direction and really used sports as that kind of competitive outlet. I had, I think, a lot of repressed anger that I tried to get out through sports and
Hmm.
really want to compete. I was always really intuitively like in kind of intelligent. Always did well naturally in school, but I was just kind of as I got a little bit older, like just do enough to get by, and I was smart enough that I could do that. But then when I got older and realized, like, that was kind of a crutch for me. Um, but yeah, let's see. I've always been interested in kind of the deeper ideas, and that's come out more as I've gotten older. But yeah, I'm not sure
Hmm.
if any of that resonates with you, but just some of my
Yeah,
reflections that came up.
there's a lot of parallels there. I think Dave was spot on in connecting us together. I can sense the intuitive intelligence for sure. How is that? How have you been able to tap into that more and more along your journey, and how have you kind of awoken to those powers or that intelligence within you, and kind of realizing even that you were picking up on other people's emotions and perhaps taking them on as yours, quote unquote, and just your kind of journey with that side of intelligence. is very profound.
Yeah. Trying to think where it would be best to start. I mean, a couple of things I was drawn to and studied psychology in college.
Yeah.
Um, that's kind of a natural topic that I've always been interested in. I went on a mission for my church to northern Mexico. I lived in like Juarez for a couple years, right on the border. It was like the most dangerous city on earth when I was there. And
Wow.
I had some experiences there as a missionary that were quite profound and helped me kind of realize my own empathetic nature and some of the that I understood some of these like more subtle intuitive things. So I was drawn to psychology in college. That's what I studied. I originally wanted to go that direction. Um, and like, do a master's or a PhD and like stay somewhere in that field. Uh, I got roped into doing sales for the summer, door to door with my
Hmm.
friends right when I got home from being a missionary. And I'm like, I've been selling Mormonism for free. So yeah, you want me to go like sell some alarm systems? I'll go do it. And found that even though I didn't like sales, like as an introvert, it made me quite uncomfortable, but I was good at it. And I think part of it was I could relate to people. I could pick up on things and I was different than your typical salesperson. So I ended up in sales for 17 years. Like
Mm.
the money was there and the
Hmm.
psychology route like was going to be a lot of school and starting out like, the money just wasn't there. And looking back on it, I'm realizing that I was also sensing into these systemic issues where like I had drive to create a certain style of life, to have a family and like provide for that family in a certain way. And
Hmm.
I was picking up on that, like the deck's kind of stacked against you to try to get ahead. And so I gravitated toward the money side, even though it wasn't like deeply what I was passionate about. And yeah, like that was good, but like my anxiety continued to grow over the years. I had a lot of physical pain that manifested due to this kind of internal war that was going on. And I never quite understood it. I have three kids. I've got my oldest is severely autistic. He's 10 years old. He's still in diapers. He's nonverbal. He's really aggressive. So like you add that and my nervous system just got like really ramped up, stressed out, and that pain continued to grow. And I remember that, like, at some point, I realized that maybe all my physical pain wasn't just like a physical manifestation, it was something deeper, like rooted in the emotions.
Hmm.
And to get to your question, I know this is kind of a long roundabout way
Please,
to
yeah,
get there. Uh,
take as long as you want.
but but yeah, a few years back, I remember having a pretty big breakthrough when I did some of those personality tests. I had done them in the past and read them, and they, for whatever reason, like whatever stage I was at, it just didn't like it made sense, but it didn't really land with me. And the first one was when I did the Myers-Briggs personality test. INFJ was what I got, introvert, intuitive, judging, feeling, and just reading through that, like I really started to understand myself. And I had some big breakthroughs with like, oh, I actually pick up on other people's emotions. And like sometimes I can be disturbed and it's like so like started to track it. It's like, if someone near me is
Mm.
in distress, it triggers something in me that I pick up on that energy. And like, so I started to follow that and really, understand it. And as I read those personality tests, it was like, hey, what careers are good for an INFJ? Sales was never on the list, actually. And I was always confused, like, why am I in sales? If, you know, yeah, it said like social work and, some of these other professions fit well into that. So that was a big breakthrough for a while. And then like 9 months later, someone told me to do the Enneagram. And so I did it. And interestingly, I was an eight on the Enneagram, which ChatGPT was just coming out at the time. So I started to do some research. INFJ is like the least common Myers-Briggs for a man, especially it's like less than 1% of males or something like that. And then
Wow.
if you overlay that with the Enneagram, the least like an INFJ is the least common combination is with an eight. They're like polar opposites because the eight is like totally type A, break down walls, like nobody's gonna stop me, you're not gonna control me, not afraid to just like speak up and kind of like be a little bit of a
Is that the Challenger one? Is that
I think I'm trying to remember
the
what
word for
it's.
it?
I'd have to let's see, NFJ era, Enneagram. I used to know it. Yeah, the Challenger. Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know how I
So
remember that.
anyway, yeah, good memory. What I'm getting at here is I started to realize that these two parts of me were like seemingly at odds with each other. And a lot of my internal conflict from a young age was that like that eight that wanted to go disrupt and challenge, that made the introverted INFJ side of me like really uncomfortable. And
Mm,
those two parts were like constantly at war with each other. And
mm,
so, being able to get those two parts to like start to understand each other and figure out how they could work together uh, was a big breakthrough. So that's a little bit of the story there. And, since I've started to realize that even bucketing yourself with that story of I'm this and I'm this, like, I think it's helpful at a certain stage of development, and then at a certain point, like you have to transcend that even and step away and realize that like we all have every part of the Enneagram and every part of the Myers-Briggs inside of us. And how can we like use those different capabilities when the situation um, depends on it? So as of late, I'm less identified. I still see when the eight and the INFJ are showing up, but I'm less identified with like that's what I am and this is who I am. And that's like, just a lever to pull on. Anyway, long answer to your question.
yeah, no, I appreciate it. The term that keeps popping up is non-dualism, especially after you
Mhm.
talked about these polar opposites and the friction between them. What's been kind of a broad question, but what's been your experience with non-dualism?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked it. It's kind of where I was going to go with it actually is I have a meditation teacher who I came across back in 2018 uh, that I listened to him on a podcast. It was around the time that I was starting to kind of like ease into this type of inner work. Like,
Mm,
um, but his name's Thomas McConkey. He runs a group for those that are interested called the Lower Lights Wisdom. So I'm part of a little sangha and have kind of meditated under him and studied
what's a
under.
Sangha?
A sangha is like a group or a community.
Okay,
It's just like the Eastern kind of Dharma talk for a community.
gotcha.
Um, and I came across him, and he practices a style of contemplation or meditation that's called IPP, which stands for Integral Polarity Practice.
Mm,
Um, was created by a guy here in Utah named John Kessler, and my teacher Thomas was kind of the first one to be trained to facilitate this type of meditation. And what IPP does, it looks at there's like 21 different polarities or seemingly polar opposite forces. Um, some of them are innate and just come online when you're a human being, like you come into the earth,
mm,
and other polarities activate as we develop over
mm,
time. And the style of meditation, this is actually what really helped me to recognize these polar opposites in the eight and the INFJ. This style of meditation, it's you kind of work with these polarities, and they use a technique called voice dialogue. So it's kind of like the love child of a few other uh, modalities that came together. This man John Kessler uh, kind of created it, but it pulls from a Jungian therapeutic technique created by a couple that were therapists named Hal and Sidra Stone, where you
mm,
get different parts of it's like parts therapy where you're getting different voices to speak to each other. And there was a Zen monk who took that um, voice dialogue concept and found that if he got his group of monks to start speaking in first person from different voices, that like something would happen. And
mm,
so this guy, John Kessler, created this modality where you take, like, say, for example, control versus submission. So this seemingly polar opposite pair. And the facilitator will, ask you to like sense into control, this voice of control in your body, really like see where you feel it, sense into it. And then he'll ask questions and you speak in first person as if control is speaking. So say, I'd like to speak to the voice of control. What do you do? What's your job? What are your gifts? What do you do for Matt, etc.? What do you do for Cole? And
Mhm.
you kind of dialogue like that, speaking, as control. I help create structure and boundaries and all that stuff. And then you look at the other side and speak in first person, and then you're like, you know, what's your relationship to the other one? And so
Mm.
they get control and submission to talk to each other. And then you're invited to come to a still point, what we call the still point, which is this non-dual place of rest that transcends and includes both control and submission, and they're one thing, they're two sides of the same coin. And then you speak from that voice
Mm.
and you kind of watch what happens. So I had done that style of meditation for a while, uh, and then as I learned that I had these two parts, I basically did that practice. So I would like journal. This INFJ side of me would introduce itself to the eight, say, hey, let's pretend we're like, colleagues on a work project, and let's introduce each other. Like, here's who I am, here's how I operate, here's what my gifts are, and here's what's uncomfortable for me. Now you can introduce yourself, and then let's talk about like, hey, we have some synergy here, and like, ooh, this is, if we're working on a project together, like here's where we might struggle, and you might make me uncomfortable, and might make you uncomfortable. And like
Mm.
just that technique of like dialoguing back and forth. I even named them. The INFJ I called Dumbledore, and the eight I called Roy Kent. Um, just to like kind of give
From Ted
them some
Lasso?
from Ted Lasso.
Yeah,
Yeah, like just that anger and
that's
just like,
hilarious. Yeah.
go. Like, yeah, I use ChatGPT to figure out like, hey, in movies, like what characters are INFJs? Dumbledore was an INFJ. Roy Kent was an eight. I kind of, it was just a way for me to like make them come alive.
Yeah. Personify them a little
Uh,
bit. Yeah.
so yeah, but now I very much look at them as like, and don't get me wrong, I'm not always operating from here. Sometimes I get really contracted and they're quite opposite, clashes. But the practice is to get to the point where you're operating from that still point. And it's like, hey, Roy Kent and Dumbledore are really the same thing. And
Mm.
like, when is it useful to like let Roy Kent go, go break a wall down and let a little bit of fire out? But Dumbledore's like giving him permission to do it,
Mm.
Like, hey, this is useful. And it's like, it's coming from a place of like love and challenge that's going to help, it's altruistic and it's going to help the whole to
Yeah,
grow,
wholeness. Yeah.
as opposed to like Roy Kent just being unbridled to like let his rage out and be vengeful at somebody.
Yeah, that's kind of like a separate entity or being or yeah, life form. So what's been more specifically your experience with that? Like what did you find popped up when you started practicing this and you were writing the journal? What did you kind of realize? And then how did you start to tap into that still point and what was your experience from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this happened right around the time when like a lot of this deep inner work was going on and it
Hmm.
was bubbling up to the surface. And around the same time, I can't remember if it was before that like journaling exercise or after, the details are murky to me. But right around that same time, like um I had a profound spiritual awakening that happened.
Mm.
Um this was like early last year, early 2024. In a lot of ways, I credit Bitcoin like for cracking me open enough to start. I talk about, 2018 is when I got into Bitcoin. I tried to get through the noise of Bitcoin versus crypto. It took me like a year, but quickly the Bitcoiners were like talking about first world problems and all the big issues. And I was like, oh yeah, these guys are, I like what they're talking about. The crypto guys, I don't even know why it matters or like what they're talking about. It's
Yeah.
just like a
Yeah.
foreign language, and why does it even matter? And then in 2020, I went down the rabbit hole, started connecting the dots. Jeff Booth and some of these other people really profoundly impacted me. But it was such a paradigm shift that I was like, what else am I missing? And so over the following years, I really started to like deconstruct everything and question all my basic assumptions. Like, what else at the like anything that I just take to be true? Let's look at it.
Mm,
And so over that process of a few, fast forward like 4 years, and around the same time of what we've been talking about, like this new state of consciousness just crept up on me. And I'd been meditating with this guy Thomas. He talks about developmental psychology, and I'd been learning about development. But all of a sudden, I'm like on a plane to San Diego for a business trip, and then I was going to be heading to Florida with my family and for vacation. And I'm on the plane, and it was like this subtle shift. I'm looking out the window, and my body just kind of released. There was like this deep peace
mm,
coming from a really deep part of me that I'd never really felt before. And it was like either my body released or the anxiety went away or it just wasn't a problem anymore. I
yeah.
don't know. But it was this welcome feeling. And then it built over the course of that vacation, like quite profoundly. There was just this new state of consciousness where, where they talk about, where you're kind of detached from the ego and you're just observing. Like I was in that state for like 3 weeks and I started to see symbolism everywhere. Everything was beautiful. I was making these like deep connections. Everything started to make much more sense. And I was just watching my emotions, like what was going on under the surface, and just like observing it. And it was interesting that week. Like I have 40 pages of journal entries
Mm,
that just started to come out. Like all my repressed emotions were starting to like make their way out. And so I think to get to your question, like as I've tapped into that, and like I say, I don't know exactly when. It might have been right after that I started to do that journaling. I really can't remember,
mhm.
but I don't think the timing's that important. But over the course of the last couple, 18, 19 months, I've felt like all that emotion that was tied up in the body start to like release. And I had a lot and have a lot, like, they talk about like Kundalini awakening, where you get different tremors and bodily
Yeah.
sensations. Like that's been going on for the past year. At first, it was really disorienting, and it would go from like expansive peace to like the nervous system contracting back to what it knows, and like
Mm,
it was quite volatile. But really, it's been like the nervous system starting to rewire. I find that like the creativity starts to come out. And that actually culminated in like 4 months ago. I'd been feeling the pull back to psychology, consciousness, and 4 months ago, it just like culminated, and I quit my job with like no plan, and was just like, all right, we're starting something new. That
let's
was kind of
go.
the culmination of that process. It really felt like a death and rebirth type
Mm,
type process, and here we are. Yeah.
that's beautiful. Yeah, life is a process of death and rebirth, which is, yeah, fascinating and can be quite the roller coaster. So you
Yeah.
said that Bitcoin kind of woke you up to start questioning the things that you were assuming about, you know, I'm I'm kind of assuming or presuming that it was more related to the world initially, like the systematically how things operated. But I'm curious how you started to question assumptions you were making about yourself or kind of your inner world or your being, everything in that realm along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like such a gradual thing that happens. It's like in Bitcoin, they say gradually, then suddenly, right?
Mm,
It was very much like that. So yeah, at first, like, I started to question systems and uh, incentive structures, everything like, okay, if the money is like this base layer of society and then it influences all these things from politics to energy to geopolitics, like there's so much that flows out of this one thing. And not to say that like, Bitcoin, sometimes people say Bitcoin like fixes everything, and I don't think that's the case. Even Bitcoin, if we don't like upshift consciousness, it's all for naught. But I do think it's a tool that helps to upshift
precisely.
consciousness
Yeah.
and can
Yeah.
can help us do that. So I like they're maybe not separate things. But I started to question those types of things. And frankly, like during that period, my anxiety was high enough that like I started to get really pessimistic on the world. Like you
Mm,
start to break down the financial system and like make the logical deductions of where this thing's going and like how it ends. Um, it's not good, right? Like
yeah.
the money printing and like all the problems that we're seeing are just like symptoms of this deeper underlying first principles thing that's going on in the world. So I started to get pretty pessimistic, but that was the first step, was kind of looking at these systems and understanding how one thing affects everything else and how like complicated everything is. And then yeah, like that started to make me go, like I just thought money was this, thought we needed inflation. I thought like that's just what I've been taught. So what other things have I been taught? So that
Mm,
started with, we're talking about religion. Like I grew up in part of a religious upbringing that has a very certain worldview on like, and quite honestly, it's like really binary. It's like we have the truth and nobody else does. And that started to like not sit well with me. Um, I started to question like, oh, is that really true? Like,
mm,
is that assumption true? And I started to see that I started to like study the Eastern different religions and all sorts of different religions. And what I found was actually like, in a lot of respects before, and people at my church will find that as like threatening. Like, no, you can't
yeah.
go look for truth somewhere else because that's like discounts, what we have. But I found that it started to like actually make my faith stronger because I was seeing the same concepts just in different words and in different culture. So that I started to break down some of those. It was really uncomfortable though, because I've been taught a certain thing since a really young age to think a certain way. So like deconstructing that is quite um, challenging to your own
Yeah.
emotional state, and then like how open can you be with people around you because they like so it's a delicate dance, but then slowly that started to like creep into this. And I don't think it's separate from what we talked about with the personality stuff and all the other stuff to bubble up. I'm
Hmm.
like, oh, okay. um I don't know exactly what I started to sense into, but there was these, I'm writing about it this week that like a human being is like the microcosm of the universe. Like if you want to
Yeah.
Gurdjieff is this Sufi mystic that I love, and he talked about like if you want to understand the universe, understand yourself.
Yeah. Master
And you,
yourself, then master the universe.
yeah, and you start to see this war, like the war out there that's happening right now with country versus country and ego, like all this stuff. Like that war was happening and is happening inside myself. And so if we want to like make change in the world, it sounds cliche, but as you feel into it and like you do your own inner healing, and then like everything outside of you starts to warp around that, and like that creates ripple effects in your family and your relationships at your job. Like so, um, I don't know exactly what it was about Bitcoin, but it did something to crack me open to start gradually looking from systems to
Hmm.
like, oh, there's a gigantic, complex, adaptive system living inside of me
Hmm.
that's exactly mirrors what's going on in the world. And many times, those things out in the world that would make me uncomfortable, it's not that the thing out there is uncomfortable, it's triggering the exact same thing inside of me, but I'm saying it's out there.
I think the your journey is actually a microcosm for at least part of the essence of Bitcoin in its ability to upshift consciousness because you were
Yep.
kind of in this fiat structure, whether internally or externally, kind of in a job that maybe didn't connect with you, perhaps. But once you adopted Bitcoin and started to go down further into it, you started to go more and more inward, which then upshifted your consciousness, which I think is what's happening collectively, globally
Yeah. Hmm.
around the world. And because money is that foundational base layer that's connected to so many different things, it has such a profound impact. That's basically the roots of our species, for better or for worse right now. Like
Yeah.
you can get a little bit deeper than that, but the incentive structure that money creates is incredible and so vast and impactful that shifting it to something like Bitcoin would have an incredibly vast and impactful and profoundly beneficial impact on actually consciousness, which again, you have seen in yourself as an example of
Excuse me.
Bitcoin as
Yeah.
a tool to do that. And you mentioned that crypto, like nobody's talking about like non-dualism on a crypto podcast. It's just not happening. And so you
At least we haven't found them, right?
at
Yeah.
least we're not aware of it. So you mentioned that you kind of made your way through the noise of crypto, within a year,
Hmm.
which um it took me like a year, a little bit over a year actually, a similar time frame, but you say crypto basically doesn't matter. So then obviously that implies Bitcoin does matter. So why does Bitcoin matter?
Yeah, when I say that crypto doesn't matter, I don't know that that's all the way. Um, we tend to get dualistic as Bitcoiners
Yeah,
even, and really Bitcoin can become like the religion and this way to create separation. So I want to be careful
yeah, I
to not
appreciate
do
that.
that. And um, going back to like my journey of going through it, I think, at first, like, it was funny. My neighbor introduced me to Bitcoin. It was 2018. Like, I was at a tech company, and I remember when it went up to like 20K, the whole sales trading floor, or the sales floor, like people were trading it, tons of money thrown in, and people were making money. And then, like, some guy just like lost a ton of money, and he was like, my wife's gonna kill me. Like, it was this
Mm,
mania phase of retail.
yeah.
I had no idea what was going on. I was like, you guys are crazy. And
Mm,
then it crashes back down to like, 7, 8,000. And I'm at a church event with my neighbor and friend, and he was started to kind of give me the pitch on how blockchain technology like fixes the world and like what it is. And
hmm.
intuitively, I was like, huh, yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna throw some tax return money into it. It just crashed down. It seems like a good time to buy. I'm gonna hold it for 5 years and just like see what happens. Speculative investment. And then, my friend even like he didn't get Bitcoin versus crypto. Like, he was in Bitcoin and all these other coins, and he was sending me these podcasts. Like, I can't even remember what they were called, but I would listen to them on my drive. And it was, they were talking about like every little coin and all these things you can do with it that's really cool. And I was just like, this sounds really cool, but it's a foreign language. And the whole time I was just like, why does this matter? Like, that was my main question. Like,
Right.
I think naturally I'm kind of a systems thinker and a first principles thinker. Like, I tend to try to look a little bit deeper beneath like what's going on to tie it back to the why. And I just didn't get that with them. And then I can't remember which podcast it was, maybe something with Preston Pish originally, but or Robert Breedlove. Somehow I got into the Bitcoiners, and they're talking about inflation, money printing, and that this is like this evil thing that's like infesting the world. And they're talking about, the wealth gap. They're talking about energy, like big ideas. And I was just like, okay, this is interesting. Yeah, if we can actually use this to like fix some of the big issues in society, then I'm interested.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so I started to listen to that, over the next little bit. That was probably by 2019. And then COVID happened, and like the light bulbs were just going off, because I'm like, everything these guys are talking about is like happening. They were talking about the food supply. They were talking about like money printing and how they can't stop. And even like vaccine stuff, some of them, like I had heard them talking about it before COVID happened. So that's when I was just like, okay. So I started working from home, and I was just like down the rabbit hole, listening to everything I could consume. It was kind of all consuming. Um, but as far as back, with that context, it became clear to me that, and I really liked Jeff Booth's thesis, like that profoundly impacted me. it was another big paradigm shift on like
Yeah.
inflation versus deflation, and how like the internet and technology is this deflationary force, and we've got this inflationary monetary system that's like the two systems they don't work. They're on a it's two freight trains going right at each other full speed.
Hmm.
And this idea that Bitcoin was a protocol just like the internet, and there would be a winner take all base layer protocol, and that the internet didn't just take off. There was a base layer and like all the layers on top of it that got built for us to be able to just click a button and sit here and talk to each other. Like that
Yeah.
took 25, 30 years of incremental technology being built on top of the base to be able to do that. And so my theory kind of became, oh, I think Bitcoin is this base layer because it is decentralized, secure, um, and that there's these three sides to a triangle: decentralization, security, and scalability. And you can kind of only have two of those three without sacrificing the other one. And so
On the base layer. Yeah.
yeah, like on the base layer. So yeah, decentralization and security are the most important, and then you scale in layers. So back to
Exactly.
my point of why it, like, on some levels crypto doesn't matter as a base layer technology, because if you optimize for scalability, you're sacrificing decentralization or security. I don't want to sacrifice either of those. But some of those features that like crypto is trying to solve for, like
Hmm.
speed, like um, you know, anonymity,
Yep.
um,
Privacy, low fees. Yeah.
those are all
Buildability. Yeah.
very worthy things, and we need all of those things. I just don't think I think it's going to be built on layers on top of a sure foundation of Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and that's going to enable so many other things. And actually, we need so many other things to like really make the world what we want it to be. And
Hmm.
it's this open-ended protocol where I think that allows us to go build so many of the other things. And we need to upshift consciousness so the things that we are building are well thought out and that they're not causing harm, and there's so many other things to fit into it. So I do think the crypto people are onto some things. Just this, how it's built and what like I don't see there being like a million base layer technologies competing with
No.
each other. Um, and I kind of got to the point where it looked like these crypto coins were like the existing as a base layer technology. Most of the crypto things are just like our existing system wrapped up in cool new wrapping paper
Exactly.
that says it's decentralized, but it's not. Like it's in
Decentralized in
name
name
only,
only.
but like
Yeah.
somebody can shut it down. There's a CEO and a marketing team. Like that is not decentralized. I don't care
Hmm.
what you say, it just isn't. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's no other base layer protocol that can be as decentralized or as secure as Bitcoin ultimately because of network effects and
Yep.
the 3D world that we live in as a result with
Yeah.
time. So yeah, it's and it converges on one and there's so many other things. But I don't I wonder if you've ever played poker before because you'd be a really good poker player. I'm not sure if the Latter-day Saints would give that the two thumbs up, but I just intuit that you'd be a really good poker player. Just as a random comment.
I have played a little bit of poker, and I haven't played poker since I've like done some of this internal healing and have a little bit more control of my own kind of internal state.
Hmm.
So it would be interesting. I used to be part of a poker group, and I didn't play enough, but I could be dangerous enough, but I would tend to get a little over emotional. So
A
yeah, I
little
think
Roy Kenty. Yeah.
yeah, and I would have my moments, and I was picking up on cues and reading different things, but I was also my mind was so overactive that I would get like totally overstimulated, and I was way too in my head.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, and yeah, the Latter-day Saints, it's funny, they're like on the surface will say, yeah, it's bad, but oh, there's a lot of Mormons that play a lot of poker, and you get them on that, there's a lot of repressed stuff going on under there that needs to come
Yeah, for
out. And
sure.
so yeah, but yeah, poker, I have a blast with poker. It's been probably 4 years since I played.
Yeah, don't tell anybody, but I have played poker for money in a church in a Mormon church before inside, like
Nice.
probably 20 feet from the stage. Uh, but how
That's
does,
great.
which is amazing, but don't tell anybody. How does how does Bitcoin upshift consciousness? Is it because yeah, I'm curious what you think of it.
Yeah. Um, a couple of things. Like, first off, I think based on my own experience, it's that the ability to crack you open. Like, Bitcoin is, in some respects, an ego test.
For sure.
I've heard it called that, and I think that's true. Because in order to like fully accept Bitcoin, its thesis, the problem that it intends to solve, you have to admit that you were wrong on some of your assumptions. So that the very nature of being willing to have that type of a shift, in my opinion, is what, in my case, like cracked me open to ask other questions. So there's that angle to it. And then there's other people, like I've met people that it's like the reverse. They have the whole spiritual stuff. Like I've met some people that have been in consciousness meditation, like this type of stuff for 20 years, and they've been doing it. And then when they do get into Bitcoin, even though some of them, it takes them a while to see it, but once
Hmm.
they see it and start asking the questions, they like they can pick it up so much faster because they're like, oh, they see the patterns, right? They see the patterns in like the consciousness stuff where, yeah, to like access higher states and stages of consciousness, you have to let the old pass away and be willing to, let go of your assumptions. And that's challenging. So there's kind of those two angles. And then, the other angle, and I'm not sure if you listened to it. I went on Robert Breedlove's podcast last
I've
month.
listened to like the first hour 15, hour 20 of it.
Okay, cool. So in that podcast, we went through like, a very, we got into like the stages of consciousness
Hmm.
through a very specific lens, which I feel like is helpful. So you might have a little bit of background on how I explain that. I don't want to go like too deep, but the premise is that individuals and collective groups uh, go through distinct stages of consciousness, starting in childhood up through adolescence. And the new research is showing that adults continue to develop essentially forever. Like there's no
Yeah.
end to this consciousness. But you know, at least the way I make sense of it, and some of these developmental theorists, like I've studied enough to be dangerous. It's not my vocation, and I haven't done like a master's degree on it to where I'm like some of the nuance. So some of the science people might like argue with me. So with that,
Hmm.
preface, the way I see it is like humans go through these different perspectives. First person perspective, where there's like me and nobody else. Second person perspective, where you start to realize, oh, there's like me and somebody else, and they have their perspective, I have mine, but it's still really black and white. Third person perspective is where like subtlety starts to come online, typically around 18 to 21 years old. You like can start not just thinking about concrete objects, but you can start to think about your thinking
Hmm.
and get more subtle. um and that's where like modern science comes in, is in third person perspective. That fourth person perspective is where a lot of the inner work starts to come out. You can start to see the subtlety of the construction of your own story. That's where you have to heal a lot of these things, and you can start to recognize it. And there's like a decentralization aspect, in my opinion, at this fourth person perspective. And so I think what's going on, like in my own diagnosis, is that globally, like we're largely in the West, in the US, in like a third person. The leading edge is more fourth. Some people into like a fifth person perspective, that's still really less common, like maybe
Hmm.
1% of people. But like, fourth person perspective, the mature end of it, there's like 6 to 8% of people in that range, and not in fourth total, but like the more mature end of it. Um, So, in my opinion, globally, we're trying to make an upshift into a new stage of consciousness because individuals go through these stages and collective humanity goes through these stages. So, the way I make sense of it, at least, or the story I'm telling myself,
Yeah.
that could be deconstructed, but I think it's useful,
Hmm.
um, is that as humanity started to go into this fourth person perspective, and as we're upshifting, because we are one body, one collective that's made up of all the parts, and there's a leading edge. But as we needed to transcend and move on from this third person perspective and up into a new perspective, we needed new technologies and systems to come along to help usher in that new world where the old has to pass away. And so I think
Yeah.
Bitcoin emerged right when that shift started to happen. And it's interesting to see though, because like there's a reaction to it. And I mirror this in my own personal development. To go from third person perspective up to fourth is challenging.
Hmm.
And when when that challenge first hits, there's a tendency to just like regress back down to the second person perspective that's so black and white and we grasp on. And that's what I see happening in government,
Mm.
in global systems, is like, hey, we have all these systems that have served us well. They've gotten us through the industrial revolution. But here we have the internet come along. We've got all this deflation, and we need totally new systems, not just upgrading the existing ones. Like we need totally new ones that can operate at the speed of technology, that can account for this deflationary force. And people are starting to see it, but governments and those powers that be that are in control are like, no. And we're starting to see, like, even in government, it feels very much like we're going back toward like second person perspective, which is much more authoritarianism and one body telling people how to believe. And so, yeah, it's like
Mm.
I'm just seeing that same pattern play out. And I trust that it's good because that's how the pattern plays out. And we need to let go of the old and like surrender to this evolutionary process that new systems have to emerge for
Yeah.
humanity to upshift. So, yeah, needless to say, I think the next 5 or 10 years are going to be pretty crazy.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of death, figuratively, with these systems, uh, because they have to die for, the Renaissance, for the
Hmm.
ushering in of the new systems, and everything that comes with it. So does you said the fourth stage, would you classify humanity collectively as being in the third stage currently, and we're progressing into that fourth stage? And then I'm curious what that 6 to 8%, the more mature end of the fourth stage, actually looks like. Like, what does it manifest as?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I only have, like I say, I would defer to some other more professionals on like their assessment of exactly where humanity as a whole is.
I
I
got
think
you.
the West, like the US, I think I would, yeah, totally like third person perspective,
Hmm.
maybe late third person perspective, and this leading edge going into fourth person perspective. At fourth person, like I talked about it with Breedlove, but equality becomes really important. Um, all the voices become important. But when it's still immature, it's like that's what's the most important, is that everyone gets heard, and it's still like not super functional. At the mature fourth person perspective is where you're like, yeah, we need to hear all the voices, and we need everyone to have be heard, and yeah, that is important. And there's nuance here, and there's
Hmm.
but we can see all the perspectives. So yeah, I would say the West is largely, in my non-professional but somewhat educated on this view. And then there's other more third world countries and populations that are still operating in a second person perspective, still very black and white
Hmm.
authoritarian type. But as far as how that fits into the whole, yeah, I mean, whatever that averages out to, maybe like early third person for the whole collective world. but
Yeah.
I think the West kind of leads. Yeah, I would place the world in third person with kind of the leading edge into to fourth person. There's, like I say, maybe one different studies say 1 to 3% of people operating in a fifth person perspective.
Hmm.
Um, as a leading edge, and then there's a trailing edge of the population that's still in a first person perspective. Like the prison system is full of people who,
Mm.
for whatever reason, unfortunately, like, still are operating in that there's just me and I'm the center of the universe and everyone else is an object for me. And
Mm.
that's, I also think we have a responsibility to care for all of those perspectives. And
Yeah.
I think as you step up into higher consciousness, you realize that the way that we treat those types of people, the seeming outcasts of society, if we can't embrace and love those, then we'll never embrace and love ourselves, because we all have those parts inside of us that are the
Yeah.
outcast. Anyway, I'm just kind of rambling, but
Yeah. It sounds like the fourth stage is kind of allowing everyone to be human, like allowing humanity to be human and allowing everyone their humanity, in however that
yeah,
manifests. And and I think that's even on like an inner spiritual level, just as you said, offering compassion to the homeless person or the drug addict or even the murderer and beyond. It's like those parts, why they in some sense live inside of us, and by like resisting them or judging them or casting them off, we're actually casting off ourselves in some sense. So
yeah, exactly.
allowing everyone their humanity. And then what's past the fourth stage, the fifth and beyond?
Yeah, so the fifth stage is a big shift.
Hmm.
Um, and it's really disorienting at a personal level, having experienced it. And when I first heard about it, I couldn't it can't be processed through the mind. Like, you can't understand it logically. The fifth stage is much where all the stages before are like either or logic.
Hmm.
The fifth stage is this big, vast, like, both and, like, it
Yeah.
includes all of it. And
Now we're getting to the good
the
stuff.
big yeah, the big thing that happens there at an individual level is, up until the fifth person, really at late fourth person, this starts to come online, but it's still like not the operating system that you're operating from all the time. But up until fifth person perspective, in the first four, the ego, this egoic identity that we've created, uh, the story of who Cole is, or the story of who Matt
Hmm.
is I'm a Mormon. They grew up in, like, all the things I described to you
Yeah.
early on in the podcast. I'm these things. I was an athlete, a missionary, all psychology major. I'm this. This is what I am. I'm this or that. Like, you're creating this identity that differentiates you. And you start to realize at the late fourth person perspective that this is all a constructed story. It's just a story that we've created to make sense of the world.
Hmm.
And that's served a beautiful purpose, because you have to have that story, um, to make sense of an overwhelming experience, this human experience that we're having. And it's
Hmm.
beautiful. At late fourth person perspective, like, people, they tend to get really creative. They're much more natural. They're much more confident in who they are. Like, that naturally flows out. And then at fifth person perspective, the new driver is this: instead of the ego, your new operating system is awareness of awareness. Like, you're operating from awareness. The ego doesn't go away, but you're watching the ego as just
Yeah.
one part of, this story. And that's disorienting, because you start to realize, oh well, if that's all story, like, who am I?
And that's the
And
question.
yeah,
That's maybe the most profound question there is. And
yeah,
I, coincidentally enough, I had a profound awakening of sorts on a plane, maybe like 2 weeks ago, actually. All right. Yeah, a week ago, last week, last Monday. So I'm coming home from a 10-day kind of out of town travel where I was hanging with a friend out in Ohio, and then I spent 4 days in a darkness retreat in Oregon. And so I was coming
Oh wow.
home from this experience, and I was on a plane back to Austin, and in the last 30 minutes of this flight, I just got this intuitive hit to pay $8 for the plane's Wi-Fi to access Chat GPT and ask. And what I ended up asking it was for it to give me all of the meditation practices that exist, as many as it could name, and then a brief description of each of them. So it ended up giving me
Mhm.
39 different meditation practices. And this one in particular caught my eye. It was Atma Vichara, which is inquiry into the self. It was number 25. And it begins and ends with the question, who am I? Largely popularized by Ramana Maharshi. So I started to get
Mm.
into this rabbit hole of who am I? And I had heard about it along the way of the spiritual path, but I hadn't like explored or penetrated into it. And it's the most fascinating question because whatever question you or whatever answer you give to that question, you're actually aware of, which ultimately means it's not the answer. And it's like an answerless, formless answer that is the
Yeah.
answer, which is
Yeah.
the awareness of the awareness. And I was just like my eyebrows, I was like so baffled and felt like I was just tripping ball sack. I was like, what's going on here? And I was like seeing things and all of this was arising and happening.
Yeah.
I was like
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
Uber on the way home, like what's even going on?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it was so profound because that's the natural state. And one of my spiritual teachers, Lee St. John, I reflected what I had gone through to him, and he reflected to me that that is basically the first Kensho, the first awakening is the realization of the true self, of the
Mm.
natural awakened state. And it felt like that profound that it was like, holy, all this stuff that you're aware of is really just a story. It's like a floating little substance that you see and you can attach onto it and grasp onto it and cling to it, resist it, whatever. But ultimately, that's incredibly limiting, infinitely limiting of who you actually are. And it's actually a denial of who you are ultimately, because you're the non-dual, formless, beyond all this stuff, being or awareness, whatever your consciousness. And yeah, that was pretty profound. It was wild that it was last week, but that's really, it sounds like, because when you started to talk about the fifth stage, I was like, who am I? Just kept coming up as the
Yeah.
question. And it
Yeah.
sounds like that's very similar.
Yeah. Exactly. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
I love maybe ask you a few questions too about
Yeah,
like your
sure.
experience. It's beautiful. And it's interesting. You mentioned that this is maybe the ultimate question, and I agree with you. Bitcoin is a deep rabbit hole.
Hmm.
Um, the who am I question is the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, hopefully Bitcoin can open people up to lead them to that type of an inquiry. Um, but yeah, it's funny how your experience was on a plane, like similar to
Yeah.
mine. I had a hard time figuring out exactly what was happening, and as I've you know worked with different teachers, and I've gone through a course where we're studying each stage of consciousness for a month at a time over the course of a year, and like really going deep. And yeah, I've come to realize that that experience I had on the plane that lasted for a few weeks was kind of that initial Kensho, like you mentioned, like that
Hmm.
initial state experience where I experienced the state of that fifth person perspective. It was kind of the entry point into there. And then, there was a lot of volatility for me,
Hmm.
mostly because I had so much unhealed shadow work that ideally I would have worked through in that fourth person perspective. I kind of started to go into therapy late and had a lot in the system that needed to be worked
Hmm.
through. Ideally, you work through all that stuff in the fourth person perspective so that your transition into the fifth person perspective is volatile, and it's such a big paradigm shift that if you still have a lot of that, my teacher compares it to like a Jenga tower. If
Hmm.
if you have something down at the bottom, the whole top gets wobbly. So as you go into that fifth person perspective, if there's still, and to be clear, we always have shadow material
Yeah, for
to
sure.
work through. That never goes away. But if some of the more foundational, like early stage shadow work hasn't been worked through, speaking from painful, brutal experience, it's disorienting. And yeah, you can work with it, obviously. But I wish I would have done some of the inner work prior, um, because yeah, the transition for me was like the next year after that initial experience was like I compare it to Bitcoin in the way that Bitcoin monetizes. Like at some point you have this breakthrough, breakout into this new price discovery territory, but you don't just go there. Like you break out and then
Right.
boom, you crash back down to the previous resistance level. So in human development, we tend to do the same thing. You'll have a new state experience that you access for a little bit, you crash back
Hmm.
down, back to the previous level. And in this kind of fifth person perspective, it's such a big shift on like what the driver is and what the new operating system is that shifting back and forth between those is like kind of jarring. And until you can get used to that new territory and settle into it and operate where that becomes the new stage feature. Not to say you don't still have the volatility and you notice when you're crashing back down, but you learn how to just like open up to it and not resist it, just kind of like breathe through it and notice what's going on and have a
Yeah.
more non-dual perspective about it. Like, I'm not going to resist this. Nothing bad. This is part of being human.
Hmm.
Yeah, those are just a few reflections.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you mentioned it like that because the book that I picked up and earlier this year I kind of had a dark night of the soul experience where
Yeah.
I I recorded a solo podcast, and after this is at my house in Austin, and after I recorded the podcast I came inside and I had ordered a book, The Untethered Soul, which
Yep.
kind of had
Great book.
opened me, fantastic, kind of opened me to the spiritual path in 2022, but I'd given it to my brother and I felt called to buy it and start reading it again. So I go out to my front porch because I got an email that said your Amazon package had been delivered. I go out to the front porch and grab the Amazon package and I open it up and it's this book, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. I'm like, what? And I realized I had ordered it from a recommendation from Lee St. John, and that was the book that had arrived, unbeknownst to
What'd you
me.
say
And
the
it's
book was? Sorry.
After the Ecstasy, the Laundry.
After the Ecstasy of the Land. Send me that after. And
It's
yeah.
it's fantastic. It's one of the best books I've read, but it touches on this. And so I opened it up to this page 113, and literally the section that I read was the dark night of the soul, like in the midst
Yeah.
of this thing. And it talked about separation from the divine, which is
Yep.
once I kind of reconnected that and actually, yeah, reconnected to the divine and God and divinity in that sense, it started to the dark night of the soul, some light started to come in, if you put it
Yeah.
that way. But anyway, so after this darkness retreat, when I emerged on Saturday, I came out and,
How long was
just
it? You said 4 days?
5 nights, 4 days. Yeah.
Okay. Crazy.
So I came out on Saturday and emerged, and then a couple hours later, I just felt to read a book, and I went into my backpack to pick up Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender by Hawkins. And so I
Yeah.
reached into my
Great one.
backpack and I pull out a book, and again, it's After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. Like again, just happened to pick
Yeah.
this thing up, thinking it's something else. And so I open it up and I start reading, and it's just like opening up so many different things. But it was that book that I kept reading over the next couple of days that led me into that ChatGPT moment on the plane, which then led to that
Mm.
awakening.
Yep.
But I say
Yep.
all of this to say that even in the title of the book, after the ecstasy, the laundry, it highlights that same expansion contraction nature of your experience or Bitcoin or just the human experience in general of duality and balance and really the universal experience, which is it's like kind of a lot of the times with spiritual stuff, you hear about the enlightenment stories and the super blissful, peaceful, euphoric state that someone experiences during a meditation retreat or something like that. But you don't hear about the flip side. And there's so
Right.
many stories within this book of, saints and yogis and masters all across the world having these experiences, but then they come back and some of them get into severe depressive episodes for months and they're like battling through it just on the flip side. And it's quite profound and deep and enlightening in its own way because it's it's
Yeah.
it's a full embraceal of our humanity, full embracing of our humanity. And it's super cool. But yeah, it's a super cool book and I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, I love it's a deep pattern that it's pointing to, and it's found so many places. And then, yeah, you experience it in yourself,
Yeah.
then you start to see it everywhere, and you start to trust it. Not to say it's not really difficult. I was reminded of when you were saying that. Shinzen Young is a guy who I really like. He really influenced my teacher Thomas. And when
Mm-hmm.
I had kind of my awakening experience on the plane, I was reading this book, The Science of Enlightenment by Shinzen Young. Um,
Mm.
he's really interesting because he's done the Eastern like monastic training pretty hardcore, and he's like a hardcore Western scientist, and
Mm.
he's trying to bridge ancient Eastern wisdom with modern Western science, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And another cool non-dual kind of polarity that I think is coming online for humanity.
Yeah.
But in his book, he talks about, and there's different definitions of enlightenment. So I'll preface that, but he says like, enlightenment or awakening is simultaneously the most, I can't remember exactly what he says, but the most profound and exhilarating yet devastating thing that can happen to a human being.
Yeah.
And that's my experience. I hear that when you're describing it. And I think, what it comes down to is uh, the commitment to experiencing the full depth of humanity, whether that be the
Mm.
positive, the types of feelings that we want to feel that feel good, like what you're describing in a meditation retreat, or a big, peaceful, enlightening, expansive experience, like opening up to feeling that fully and not grasping onto it to only want to feel that, let it pass. And then on the flip side of that, like, and I think it's this coming back to polarity,
Mm-hmm.
it's this polarity and being willing to open up to the reality of this human experience, which is profoundly intense, which is disturbing.
Yeah.
If you open up to it, like every day, there's pretty deep disturbance that comes up,
Mm-hmm.
and if you're not open to feeling that, you're going to find all these ways to not feel that, and that's at the root of like all the stuff we were talking about childhood and all these coping mechanisms. But as you awaken to the true nature of reality, and if you're committed to the spiritual path, it's it's opening up to feeling both sides of it. And in my opinion, you can only have the expansive, like your expansion, and the peaceful side of what you're able to feel as a human being is exactly, you know in proportion to what you're willing to feel on that other end of the spectrum and open up
Mm-hmm.
to. Um, and so, yeah, I've started to, still really hard. I'm not good at it when I get contracted and feel disturbance, but, I'm trying to be with it, open up to it more. And
Mm-hmm.
after having gone through my own dark night of the soul, similar to what you described, that was mostly, a large part of the last year and change, started to trust that when you're in that, let's pay attention to where it's when it's there and when it starts to dissipate, because on the other end of that there's this other side of the polarity, and
Hmm.
the light is always going to be there, and everything is what's the word, everything passes.
Yeah,
It's all temporary.
this
um,
too shall pass. Yeah,
it's
and
impermanent. Impermanence was the word I was looking for.
precisely. And it's so paradoxical because even like for me, it's like acceptance, for example, or feeling into it.
Mm.
Like acceptance actually doesn't require any effort because who you actually are is already all accepting. It's more so the dissolution of the thing that you think needs to accept that's actually in the
Yep.
way of the natural state, which is all accepting. That is the work. At least that's kind of the way I see it at this point, which is it's like weird and paradoxical, but extremely enlightening and profound and leads to awakening in some sense. And it's like there's no and my teacher again, Lee St. John, has kind of started to come into this on his own recently, and he's been down the path for 17 plus years. He's starting to realize it a bit more. Like there's no thinker, there's only thoughts. There's no seer, there's only sights, and that's a radical position almost. Uh,
Mhm.
but seeing through that is almost equally as radical in the enlightening sense because you tap into again this state, this awareness that's already everything you could want it to be. It has all of the space for all of the things. It just requires the dissolution of that which you are not. And that's what Ramana Maharshi would say is the finding out the answer to who you are is just essentially finding out the answer and figuring out that which you are not. And then you arrive at just this formless, spacious, boundless, timeless being that you actually are, that
Mhm.
is, the whole thing. That's non-dual and everything that comes with
Yep.
that.
Yeah, and when you're saying that, like I've experienced some of those state experiences like you're describing, and just to tie it back to that stages model, sixth person perspective above and beyond fifth is that time, like timeless, boundless. There is no identification with self. It's all transcended, and it's just one.
Yeah.
So I think the sixth person perspective is where non-duality becomes like the operating system, and
Mm-hmm.
the new place that you're operating from. Um, that's kind of I've had those, again, I'm tapped into it, but that's clearly not where I operate from generally. And I think the people that operate from there, in my experience, also would never tell you that they do. Um,
Mm.
just having seen it, um, there's something about them, and they actually, you know, they start to be mostly like really soft spoken and don't say as much. They allow just reality as it is to speak for itself, and there's this deeper
Fascinating.
trust of everything. And Dr. John Churchill, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but
Mm-mm.
like I'm fascinated by his concepts as he explains this like stages model, and first through like fifth, sixth person perspective. He's like, it's interesting when you go through an awakening into like fifth and sixth person perspective, at fifth person, you might think you're like hot shit. And he's like, and you kind of are, because it's like statistically speaking, not very common. But even these higher ends of consciousness that we're tapping into in fifth and sixth person perspective, like the new research is saying there's a seventh person perspective, which I have no clue what it even is. Um, but his point was these fifth and sixth person, like the leading edge of where we're at in humanity,
Mm-hmm.
is in his description still like middle school.
Mm.
Um, so there's so much more I think beyond this planet and in the cosmos of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, I like that framing because it keeps there's if you ever think you've arrived, I think that's probably a signal that you haven't arrived.
Yeah.
And
That's just
yeah,
another.
I guess what I'm just pointing to, like consciousness, the rabbit hole is seemingly infinite. And
Yeah.
even these topics we're talking about, it's probably like we're grade schoolers a little bit.
Yeah, and you could just ask like who is the you that thinks you've arrived? And you can just like
Yep.
those are just like fun questions and they can be it can be funny to watch the ego do its things and the mind do its things and all of the things that happen is like the grasping that constantly happens of like, oh, I've figured it out
Yeah.
and the expansions and contractions that come with that. But I think tying it back to Bitcoin as it relates to this upshift in consciousness, I think one of the biggest aspects of Bitcoin in its ability for us to ascend and transcend is time, is giving us back our time to be able to do the inner work and to
Yeah.
explore and inquire into the self and to yeah, to do so many different things that we're not really afforded the time to do currently with the current system at an increasing rate, right? We're increasingly having our time stripped away from us in the fiat system, and it's in this kind of dual balancing act that is Bitcoin in some sense, the counter-entropic realm. Uh, it's the opposite. We're increasingly granted more time, and that allows us to go more and more within. Uh, and it's interesting, even in fiat, as the system continues to exist and to survive, there's actually, at least from what I've seen, a further and further desire to go external to find validation or worth or truth, meaning, acceptance, purpose, whatever, like all of those things,
Hmm.
which is
Yep.
kind of fascinating. And the way is in, that's what I believe. And I think that's where the greatest individual shifts in
Yeah.
consciousness come from. But then, as you said earlier, it creates all of these ripple effects throughout our existence that yeah impact things in a profound way. And
Yeah. So much that you said right there. Yeah. Keep going.
I had a question in my notes here, like why does Bitcoin change us? And I think um, I'd be curious to get your answer, but I think that touches on a little bit of it. But yeah, I'd be curious to get your answer. Why and how? I mean, either or, but
Yes, and I'm just kind of trying to tie some threads together of thoughts that just came up as you were
sure,
speaking and how I can tie it in.
you can even go there first, and
Yeah, no, I think I'm there. At third person, which if we follow that strand that you were saying earlier, that are we at third person? Let's just assume we are, in at least here in the U.S. or in the West.
hmm
Mature third person perspective is all about, it's like the achiever, I think is what they call it. It's like
mm,
it's really competitive. It's kind of keeping up with the Joneses, materialism, like
exactly, yeah,
like having things, these outer things that feed our own egos to like have more, and that gives us worth. That's really prevalent at the mature third person perspective. It's like, you know, really career oriented and success doing, like there's never enough. You can't ever get enough. And one thing that's interesting about Bitcoin, I think it's subtle, but the fact that you can't touch it.
mm,
Um, And that's an interesting distinction because, I've had those discussions with like the gold bugs, that that's their big thing, is like, I can't hold Bitcoin and my gold. I can hold it as this physical, tangible thing. So when the world, you know, I've got it. And I see it from, especially from like a third person worldview, where concrete objects are still.
Mm,
really the thing. But that I think what a
mm,
more subtle thing that Bitcoin points to is like there's this thing that I can't touch it. It doesn't, I don't doesn't physically exist, but at a subtle level it does because it's backed by energy. The energy that it took to produce and mine, you know, ties that it's bounded by energy, like Jeff Booth says. It's tied to, and the incentives downstream that connects. But what I'm tying it back to is that there's this subtle idea that there's other frequencies and subtleties to reality that you can't touch or see or hear on the outside. But when you tune into the frequency or to the to the reality of it, you can touch it, see it, and feel
mm.
it internally. Like it's this inner, but it's not perceptible through the typical human senses that we talk about.
Yeah.
And that's subtle, but I think that also is maybe why Bitcoin changes us.
Mm.
Um, there's probably a whole conversation there,
That's powerful. Yeah.
but the fact that you can't touch it points you to deeper realities that aren't accessible
Yeah.
through
The
the
depth of it.
human touch, and that's a whole paradigm shift. Yeah,
Yeah. Like even like love isn't necessarily able to be touched, but hey, gold bugs, is love not worth anything because do I not
yeah,
want it because I can't touch it and feel
totally.
it and store it under my mattress? Yeah, I've never had that come across my brain before. That's super interesting. So the what more specifically about it being non-tangible makes it more profound and deeper? Is it just that it allows us to like move into these almost like non-human states in terms of like now I'm able to transcend space essentially by sending Bitcoin across the world instantly because I have, Bitcoin, which operates as it does versus gold, let's say. Uh,
Hmm.
but then you could say, well, I can theoretically transfer fiat, but then it gets into the inner workings of Bitcoin. But what's kind of your take on, yeah, how like the significance of it not being tangible and what that might unlock as we continue to exist with it?
Yeah, tying it back to that like stages model,
Hmm.
which is a frame that I use a lot right now. I'm sure at some point I'll get to where I'm not framing everything through this model. I can't wait till that happens where I can kind of, that's just this model. Um, in the early, so there's three different tiers in that model. The first and second fit into a concrete tier, first and second perspective, and like
Yeah,
the objects
gotcha.
that you can interact with are concrete. Like kids can build blocks and see, and part of their confusion is at the first, like they can't distinguish what they're seeing in their mind with what's perceived in the outside world. That's why like nightmares are so disturbing, or the things they imagine, they actually think it's real. They still can't
Mm,
distinguish between inner and outer. And then at the third person, it's they call it the subtle territory. So objects in your awareness are, you can see, still operate in the concrete world, but they're subtle. Like thinking about your own thinking is a subtle object. So it's an object that you can't see, but you create an object out of your own thoughts. So it's more
mm,
subtle in that subtle tier. And that's in third and fourth person perspective, is the subtle tier. And then there's different words in like the stages model. They call it the meta-aware tier, but it's this awareness of awareness. So the higher up you go in these tiers, the objects of awareness are so much more subtle.
mm,
So it's not just subtle in this tier, it's really fine and subtle. And they're not perceptible through the typical human faculties. And
mm,
the way I make sense of it is like in the first two tiers, like everything is really in the mind. In the West, we really worship the intellect. and this binary mind. And that's a great, the mind is really powerful.
Hmm.
There's these other capacities of the human heart. Like the heart itself has its own memories, its own energy, its own knowing. And the body also has its own
Hmm.
knowing. Um, so I think what I'm pointing to is just that distinction of something not being tangible points to a deeper truth that for consciousness to continue to develop in a human being, the objects of awareness become much more subtle and less concrete.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's so fascinating. Part of what I think about is like what actually is going to be, because if we're in, the internet came to me in what, like 1984-ish, 1983, kind of genesis of that. If we're 16 years into the internet as it relates to Bitcoin, that would be 1999, 2000-ish. And so if we're in the year 2000 of Bitcoin, what's coming around that base layer protocol that we have no idea is coming, but even more specifically as it relates to what you're saying. And then even further past that, it's what if there's a gradually then suddenly moment for consciousness itself? Because if
Yeah, yeah,
if Bitcoin monetizes in this same way of contraction or expansion and then contraction, but eventually it just in fiat terms it just explodes. But then in
yep.
actual purchasing power, as long as there's nothing like globally catastrophic that happens, productivity would continue to exponentially accelerate, and so would Bitcoin's purchasing power, Bitcoin's value. And so does
Mhm.
the rise in consciousness come with that? And then what is there a contraction on the flip side of that? What does that even look like? There's like so many awesome unknowns that live in the realm of potentiality as it relates to Bitcoin and what it unlocks for us and what it could mean moving into these further stages. So yeah, that just popped into my mind.
Yeah, that's a concept. What you're describing is like, I think constantly kind of under the surface for me. And that's what I'm trying to wrap my head around. I don't have answers. And I think that's what's beautiful
Yeah.
about it is there's this emergence that's happening and we can create like that's part of this awakening is that like, oh, if everything's a story, well then I can go
Mm,
create my own story and like create something good that's useful and that serves. Um, And so the more people we have awakened to that and that they can overlay Bitcoin and consciousness in these systems, like it's a white field for us to create and build on top of Bitcoin.
mm.
And I think we're at a moment that's building, and there's going to be some suddenly moments uh, that are going to be amazing and profoundly challenging for the current paradigm that we
That's
can't
true.
even
Yeah.
see. But
That's probably where the
yeah, the
contraction comes from.
the deflationary nature of technology. Jeff Booth says on a Bitcoin standard, like right now, he's like, we could work 10 hours a week and have more
Yeah.
than we have right now. So that's a huge paradigm shift. Our time, like you said. Um, and the thing that I'm really starting to tap into is that if we're to build on top of Bitcoin in these second, third layers to create systems for the future, it's imperative that we have more people having these consciousness upshifts to be able to operate from principles of openness and love and compassion and wisdom.
Hmm.
If we don't have that, what we build, even though Bitcoin is a great base layer protocol, if we build things that still are reinforcing duality and ego and us versus them and the US versus China and like even Bitcoin
Hmm.
will be for naught. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's this polarity of like, I think Bitcoin helps more people to upshift consciousness. but it's not a given. Like what we're gonna go build, we have to get it right, and to get it right, we need more people. So yeah, I'm hoping there's a suddenly moment for consciousness, and it seems just anecdotally, I don't know if this is because I'm more tuned into it now, but it seems like more people are having these types of experiences.
Yeah,
That's
that's
it seems to be.
that was going to be my reflection is that, you can look across so many different sectors of society and industry that it seems like, there's these shifts happening, whether it's in the food from, monocrop farming to regenerative or, seed oils
Mhm.
to tallow
Yeah.
and all the stuff there, or even like schooling, you're starting to see an increasing shift towards, private models, AI, individualistic, nature-based
Yeah.
learning,
Yeah. Yeah.
all of these things that I think are happening as humanity is increasingly waking up. And then, you can get into the stars and astrology and stuff that actually reflects the same thing, but it also
Hmm.
relates to the 1500s. And there's so many parallels. And I read about this in my book in that, you know, the TLDR is Martin Luther comes along, prints the 95 Theses, stamps it to a door, outlining the abuses of power between the monopoly of church and state. And they use a decentralized uh, decentralized method of disseminating information, the
Hmm.
printing press, which had just been invented a few
Yep.
years prior. And then that idea, essentially, that group of ideas and that story, if you will, starts to disseminate across Europe, and then the monopoly of church and state is broken up. And then on the flip side of that, and the death of that structure comes the Renaissance period of this
Hmm.
expansion in
Yeah.
consciousness, political structures, academia, culture, art, science, everything. And so you see basically the same thing where Satoshi Nakamoto, writes and posts the Bitcoin white paper to the internet, highlighting the partly the abuses of power, not directly in the white paper, the abuses of power of the monopoly between money and state,
Hmm.
and uses the internet for that story and that idea to spread, which is the
Yep.
modern day printing press, essentially. And
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
in that death of the current monopoly, and we're starting to see that Renaissance period, the expansion as a result, which is, I'm here for it. I think we
Yeah,
are
me
starting to see
too.
it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we're seeing it, and what a beautiful and amazing time to be alive. Like I don't think we're quite like everyone can feel it. There's no denying it now. Even people that are just regular people are like, "Oh, I say the next 5 or 10 years are gonna be wild." They're like, "Yeah, duh." Like you can feel it. I mean, look what's going on in the world. Um, and yeah, there's so many things converging.
Hmm.
And you know. We live at a really critical point, and I'm becoming more and more optimistic at what can emerge out of the death of the old,
Definitely.
and I want to be cautioned that I'm not too optimistic, and that like there's still so much work to do, and there's a meta crisis going on the planet, and there's a lot that we need to take really seriously. But I'm totally inspired. How old are you, Cole?
23.
23?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, like that right there shows me that's amazing. Like the concepts that you're tapping into as a 23-year-old is so inspiring to me. And yeah, there's a generation of young people that are like we need more and more people like you to be able to build these systems. Like I'm 38, I'm blown away at what you're tapping into at the age of 23 that wasn't even close to my radar. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think I've always had kind of like an anti-system view that it's developed, but it really started with me breaking away from the system at 18 by deciding not to go to college, which then,
Mm.
put me
Yeah.
down just the individualistic path. And it's like that's where all of the gold lies. That's where all the Bitcoin lies. Uh, funny enough. And it's like I write about this in my book. There was a study done by NASA in the 1960s or 1970s where they took a group of 3 to 5 year olds and they measured their creative levels, how creative they were. And 98% of them were considered creative geniuses at that age. Who knows what it is? I'm sure, it's a higher percentage even at 1 year old, 2 year old, 3 year old, and you get in further. But they
Mhm.
measured them again at, uh, I think it was nine, I think it was maybe 12 and 15 or 9 and 15. And it went down to 34% and then 12%. And then they measured adults, and 2% of them were considered creative geniuses. And I think it
Yeah.
stems from, and they took that same group of kids and tracked them. It was the same group. And it just stems from the rigid, standardized, world that stems from the rigid, standardized, kind of, yeah, boxed in structure that we live in as a result
Mhm.
of fiat, that it's like it's concrete, it's that third world, even second world, black and white. It's like, we have to
Yep.
money print, we have to print money and everything that comes with it, versus letting individuals be individuals at their truest, deepest nature from birth, which is why I'm so excited about these new educational developments, so that it doesn't take me getting to 18 or somebody else getting into their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s. It's just the natural flow of things from birth, because we've built systems around a base layer that provides for that. And I think the
Yeah.
reason why I care about Bitcoin so much is probably similar to you, in that the profound benefits it can provide to the collective in the upshifting of consciousness. And I think it's
Yep.
probably the greatest tool we have, because money, again, for better or for worse, is just so entrenched into our operational workings and systems and society in
Yeah.
this day and age. And to come across it and to see something that's um, it's backed by energy in some sense. It's aligned with the universe in that sense. And it has the proof of work to demonstrate the profound benefits that it brings about. Whether it's you
Mhm.
as your example, or me being able to access more time to do, a darkness retreat at the start of
Yeah.
June, and all of these things that come with it. And uh it's like the proof of work is there even in the monetary sense, and that's the greatest asset of all time. And
Yep.
there's so much you can even relate it back to how we started it, in that there's so much entropy and chaos with this fiat system decaying and dying, and you're seeing it devolve in that sense, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. But on the flip side, you're starting to see this awakening and expansion and
Mhm.
realization into this new paradigm. And so the story is shifting. We're deconstructing the current one, the fiat one that's dying, and we're birthing into this new world. And yeah, again, I'm here for it.
Totally. Yeah, it's been amazing. I could talk to you for a long time. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it. It's been so awesome to connect. We'll have to do it again. But yeah, I'm with you on the just to finish off that thought, the creativity piece. Um, Creating systems that allow for the creative innate capacities in human beings to like stay alive.
yes,
I've got a
yeah,
4-year old who's so creative, and yeah, you throw him in the public school system, I know that's just gonna be like shut down. And so yeah, some of those models that can be child led and curiosity led to like
precisely. Yeah,
not just tell them what to memorize and to fit into this box, but like really tap into that creativity. what would humanity look like if we had society that enabled creativity and that we didn't lose it as much and
Mm,
those creative geniuses like could operate? I don't think our minds can quite fathom it. It's quite beautiful. So
that,
that's why I care about Bitcoin too. I'm with
yeah.
you. It's totally inspiring to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much more than just a financial tool, and that side of it is great. And the number go up is a big part of it, but what it
Yeah, and you
means
need that. You
is
need that
yeah,
to tap into human emotions so they care about it. But
right. Like that's how
yeah.
I got into it was like
Yeah,
where's
that's
the
how you
best
get
place
into
to
it.
put my money
Yeah, how
and
can I get rich quick, man? Yeah, for sure.
yeah. But I really enjoyed the chat, Matt. It was a blast. I'm sure this won't be our last time. There's so much more we could dive into and go deeper on, but it was a pleasure having you on.
Yeah, and just grateful to Dave for making the connection. He was tuned
Yeah,
into
for
something,
real.
I think. So yeah, Dave, if you're watching, or if not, I'm just grateful for you, man.
I second that completely, Dave. He's like Yoda. He's incredible. Love
Yeah.
Dave. Alrighty, man. We will. Well, before we go, where can
Yeah.
the people find it online, and where can they access some of your work and your offerings?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm on X. I can send it to you. I don't know. Do you put like show notes or?
I'll put it in the description. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw some description, but X, my website, The Liminal Leap. And then I've got a newsletter that you can follow from there as well,
Hmm.
uh, where I write every week. But the Liminal Leap is a platform I'm starting with, like conscious one-on-one conscious leadership coaching for like executives and high-level leaders, where it's the kind of baseline pitch is like, hey, at some point, upgrading your business is less about throwing money at problems and more process, and it's doing the inner work
Mm,
within you and
definitely.
watching that flow out into your business. And the mission is to get more leaders to be more conscious of the very things we've been talking about. And so I'm starting there, and there's going to be some more offerings coming down the road. Tech workers that are burnt out that want to try to tap into their own creativity and figure out how to do it. Bitcoiners that are interested in consciousness. Like those are some of the avenues that I plan to go on. But yeah, right now it's just more executive coaching.
Awesome. Sounds exciting. Just like it all. Thanks again, Matt, and we will catch you on the next one.
All right. Thanks, Cole. Really appreciate it, man.
Alrighty, man.